Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute. My name is Josh Hasten, a reporter for JNS News. I am here in studio with the CEO of JNS, Alex Traiman. We are in Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Let's get to it. Top story here today. Israel's cabinet yesterday rejects the unilateral recognition of a PA state, and that's really been the rumor over the last several days, that the United States was somehow going to unilaterally just declare a Palestinian state in the midst of this war Israel's now waging against the evil, which is Hamas. There was a declaration. Israel absolutely rejects international diktat regarding the permanent arrangement with the Palestinians. Such an arrangement will be achieved only by direct negotiations between the parties without preconditions. So the prime minister, I guess, if you will, taking it to the Biden administration, the international community, saying Israel will not accept a unilateral Palestinian state. I mean, on one side, Alex, I think that is a positive statement. On the other side, it actually does leave the door open, perhaps, for some sort of negotiated Palestinian state down the road. So for those of us who are against the so-called two-state solution, should we be worried, number one? And number two, what do you think of the statement itself?
Well, the statement went on to say that any recognition following the October 7th massacre will award an immense and unprecedented prize to terrorism and prevent any future peace agreement. So that's important that he's pushing back on the idea that a Palestinian state could be the result of the worst terror massacre, the exact fear that everybody in Israel had, that if you create a Palestinian state, what you would do is create a terror state, which is what Gaza turned into. But yes, I think that you have a unique opportunity to dispel the notion of the Oslo process to begin with, right? There was a very, very simple formula. It was called land for peace. Israel doesn't have a lot of land, but it would be willing to give some of the land to the Palestinians if it could get peace in return. But now I think all Israelis see that the Palestinians had no peace to offer the state of Israel. And so Netanyahu and the cabinet have a unique opportunity to turn around and say the land for peace formula is over. The Palestinians aren't maintaining any of their obligations under the Oslo Accords. Any kind of unilateral recognition of Palestinian statehood without the Palestinians moving towards peace is also a violation of the Oslo Accords. So why should Israel be the only party that maintains its obligations under the Oslo Accords? And by the way, Israel has many obligations under the Oslo Accords, including collecting customs and tax revenues for the Palestinian Authority, security cooperation. I think that you have a unique opportunity to say, hey, we're not participating anymore in this Oslo process, and we're not even going to be willing to talk about a Palestinian state until we reach such a point where the Palestinians prepare their people for peace with Israel. Instead, it does seem like if Netanyahu is saying that the only way a Palestinian state will be reached is through direct negotiations between the two parties, that he just might be opening himself up for an invitation to a peace summit in the coming months.
Well, speaking of peace and the lack thereof, I must mention the fact that on Friday there was a terrorist attack. 2 Israelis were murdered at a bus stop carried out by an Arab from Jerusalem who went down to the Ram Junction, which is about 40 minutes south, opened fire at a bus stop, unfortunately killing 2 people, including a soldier who was, from what I understand, on his way back from reserve duty, on his way back to his family, who was gunned down at a bus stop. So just another one of, not even talking about what's going on in Gaza and the situation. Sometimes we forget about, our reality ever since the Oslo Accords, that these attacks have come up in the thousands since the 1990s.
The prime minister's in a unique position because on the one hand, he's trying to say that this is a war only against Hamas. And the United States is saying, well, not everybody who lives in Gaza is Hamas. Then you have soldiers that are inside the Gaza Strip, and they're going inside houses, inside schools, inside mosques, inside hospitals, and they're finding weapons and tunnel shaft entrances everywhere. And they're saying there's no such thing as innocent civilians inside Gaza. And then you have the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, commonly known as the West Bank. And by all accounts, they're not much better than Hamas. They're inciting and financing individuals to commit acts of terror. They're naming public squares after so-called martyrs that were killed in the act of committing first-degree murder against Israelis. And the United States is turning around saying that the Palestinian Authority should be the one ruling Gaza the day after Hamas. Meanwhile, it was the Palestinian Authority that lost control of Gaza Strip and Hamas took over. And if there would be elections in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank among Palestinians, Hamas would win those elections. And there's enough polls that demonstrate that that's the case. So, this whole concept right now that anybody in Israel is prepared to take even the first step towards a Palestinian state after we have seen what the Palestinians have to offer the state of Israel, which was this massacre of October 7th, done over and over and over again. If we would give them a state as a result of this, it's really out of touch with where the overwhelming majority of Israelis are.
Yeah, the PA and Hamas might not like each other at all, but when it comes to Israel, they're certainly on the same page in terms of both of them wanting to destroy the state of Israel. And the only difference really is in strategy. While Hamas wants to do it in one shot, the Palestinian Authority wants to do it in stages. And, they've been hiding behind this notion of peace as if they're our partners for years and years, as, again, they still have their pay-to-slay program that's still functioning, and which is a sliding scale in which they pay terrorists for how many Jews that they murder, how many Jews that they wound. They're on the PA payroll for murdering Israelis. So that's still happening today.
And I think that the big question is, why is the Biden administration promoting this while Israel's still fighting the war against Hamas? Like, wouldn't it, if that was your policy agenda, that you wanted there to be a Palestinian state, wouldn't you wait perhaps until Israel finishes Hamas, wait to see what the situation is on the day after and say, good, now you took out the terrorists in Gaza. Now let's see if we can move towards something different. But meanwhile, Israel's got soldiers, putting their lives on the line on the ground inside Gaza Strip, facing terrorists. And here you have the United States saying, if you want to keep fighting, then you need to understand that we want there to be a Palestinian state when this is all over.
And many would say the answer to that question is politics. The fact that the Biden administration, the U.S. is now headed towards elections this November. And from what we see here, just as an example, there was a recent meeting with Muslim voters in Michigan with an administration aide, and he arrived full of apologies, said that the White House knows it made mistakes in its approach, meaning the Biden administration seemed too one-sided, too pro-Israel. So what we're seeing on the ground here from all of these steps in recent weeks, his name, by the way, was, I think it was John Feiner, Deputy National Security Advisor, according to this report by CBS News.
And John Feiner says, we are very well aware that we have misstepped in the course of responding to this crisis.
In other words, they have been too pro-Israel. So now they have to pull back for the sake of politics, try to get those votes that they need for the Biden administration, or the Democrats to be reelected in Washington in November. So now they have to appear less pro-Israel. And how do you do that? You throw this whole crazy notion of a Palestinian state, so-called, on the ground while Israel's battling those we're seeking to wipe it out and create a Palestinian state in the borders of the entire country.
That's the answer that explains the timing here, is that that you have the progressive base of the Democratic Party putting significant pressure on the Biden administration. So the Biden administration wants to be able to say, okay, sure, we supported Israel because they're our ally, but it's been our policy the whole time that there should be a Palestinian state, so we're going to push that now. But the two problems here is, number one, Israelis view what took place on October 7th as an existential issue. Israel's fighting a war which is already gone on for 4 months and may continue well beyond 4 months, not just in Gaza, but this might go to Lebanon. We can talk about that a little bit later. This is a war that Israelis are fighting. They believe it's the second war of independence. It's a war for their survival. And for the United States, this is just an election issue. So that's like a big gap here in the type of thinking. But second, the idea that progressive voters are going to abandon Joe Biden and then somehow allow a Republican candidate, let's say Donald Trump, to become the president because Biden's been too supportive of the state of Israel during this conflict. I mean, for all kind of progressives, the stakes seem to be much greater than just the issue of Israel and Palestinian statehood, right? You have every progressive domestic issue, and there's a whole bucket of them. I mean, we don't discuss them on this show, but the idea that progressives in Michigan won't come out and vote and will allow Donald Trump to be president over this issue. I find it hard to believe, and I think that that's a bluff that Netanyahu administration has to call on the United States.
At the same time, there are also reports that a future peace deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, a normalization deal like Israel has with the UAE, Bahrain, and the other countries, would be paired with Palestinian statehood. In other words, if Israel agrees to establish this Palestinian entity, this Palestinian state, therefore Saudi Arabia would go forward in terms of a normalization deal. But ironically, a year ago, when we had relative quiet here, before October the 7th, Israel was already on a path towards normalization that didn't involve establishing a so-called Palestinian state. So all of a sudden you have a change.
You had the Trump administration was able to, within just a period of weeks, establish normalization agreements between Israel, broker these relationships between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, between Israel and Bahrain, between Israel and Morocco, also Sudan, but that's probably less important. And when the Trump administration was leaving office, they said they had anywhere from 5 to 10 other countries ready to sign or prepped to sign normalization agreements with the state of Israel. Now, the whole concept, one of the major concepts of the Abraham Accords, was that it took the Palestinian issue off the table. It was part of an outside-in approach, which said that the Palestinians will realize that they need to normalize with Israel when they see all of the Arab world around them normalizing relations with Israel. So it was essentially, as Netanyahu would say, removing the veto from the Palestinian Authority over peace throughout the greater Middle East. And that was directly in the face of the Obama administration's policy before the Trump administration. You had John Kerry famously saying in his last weeks as Secretary of State, no, 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 no. There's no way that there's going to be peace with any countries in the Arab world until there's peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Of course, Trump administration, they showed that was the right way to go about doing it. So what the Biden administration, when they got back into office, what they've wanted to do is to leverage the Abraham Accords and bring the Palestinian issue back on the table. Now, because they did that, they slammed the brakes on all of the momentum that you had in the Abraham Accords. While Trump said we have 5 to 10 different countries ready to sign agreements, as soon as Biden became the president, you'd have any countries all of a sudden signing any of these agreements. And then Israel tried to pick up the pieces and was pushing forward and was working on Saudi normalization in the months and weeks leading up to October 7th. In fact, there are many people that say that one of the reasons why Hamas launched the October 7th attack was to prevent this kind of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And now what you have clearly is the United States saying, they recognize how badly Israel wants and how badly Netanyahu wants normalization with Saudi Arabia. So what they're trying to do is to make it that there's a choice. And yesterday, Jack Lew, who was the former Treasury Secretary and is now the U.S. ambassador to Israel, gave his first public address last night to the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. I was there. I saw the speech, and he said that Israelis are going to have to make a choice. They're going to have to decide whether they want to have Saudi normalization, if that's a priority for them. And if it is, then they're going to have to understand that we are putting Israel on a track toward Palestinian statehood. So what they're trying to do is give a carrot and a stick, show that the only way you're going to get normalization with Saudi Arabia is if there's a Palestinian state.
The problem with that approach, the approach the Biden administration is taking, is the fact that they don't recognize, even after all this time, that this isn't the U.S.-Canadian border. This is the Middle East, where strength wins out. Your enemies respect strength, and they'll walk all over you if they see weakness. And what this type of policy does is show that the U.S. is weak, at least the administration is weak, and the Saudis don't want to do business with such a weak administration. That's really what the problem is, and they just haven't gotten it yet. Even after Obama, even after all Biden's policies, And you can see night and day, whether you like Trump or not, you see night and day between the results of the Trump administration and what you're seeing now.
I think it's also really important to understand it's not just Israel that doesn't want Palestinian statehood coupled with Saudi normalization. The Saudis also don't want Palestinian statehood coupled with Israeli normalization. All the individuals that I've spoken to that have, were inside track dealing with the Abraham Accords, that were going to Saudi Arabia, meeting with Saudi leaders, they all say that behind closed doors, that the Saudis say that they don't care one lick about the Palestinians. They believe that the Palestinians have just sucked money from Arab nations for years, have never taken the step towards peace that now you see all these other nations in the Middle East taking with Israel, and that they're fed up. And the Saudis, they're put in a tough spot because they don't want to be saying publicly that they don't care about the Palestinians. They don't want to be saying, they don't want to be the ones that are seen as throwing the Palestinians under the bus. But at the same time, they're not normalizing with Israel in order to make Palestinian statehood. They're normalizing with Israel for their own interests.
Whether it's the Saudis or any other nation in the region, any other Arab or Muslim country, the proof is in the pudding in terms of whether they care about the Arabs who live in Gaza. Not one of them has been resettled in any one of the countries, and we can talk about Egypt a little later. The fact that the border is still closed amidst a war, it's unprecedented that a border remains closed when people are trying to seek shelter. But that border is closed, and no other Arab countries stepped up. But we'll get back to that. But I want to switch here. We talked about the U.S. pressure. The UN is doing their routine when it comes to Israel as well. The regularly scheduled routine trying to condemn those who were attacked, namely the Jewish state, instead of those who carried out the attack. So there was an Algerian proposal in the Security Council, which is supposed to go for a vote at some point this week, calling for an immediate ceasefire. Question remains, will the U.S. veto it? Probably. They'll probably veto it. But if not, what does that mean? If that UN Security Council resolution passes, what does it mean practically? Does Israel then have to actually stop attacking Hamas?
Well, I think fortunately for the state of Israel, they're not going to be put into that position. It does look as though the United States is going to veto that resolution. And I think it's important to note that, we talk about it a lot, that the Biden administration and Antony Blinken and others are putting tremendous pressure on Israel diplomatically. That's true. But at the same time, they have given Israel over 4 months to operate inside Gaza. I think that they do understand that Israel's made tremendous gains in the Gaza Strip. They have not slammed the brakes on the operation. And one of the most important components to the U.S.-Israel relationship is that Israel does depend on the United States to veto anti-Israel resolutions at the Security Council. And it does indeed look like the United States will keep their part of the bargain here and veto this biased anti-Israel resolution calling for a ceasefire.
Yeah, no, I hope that happens, but there have been times the U.S. has abstained on certain votes. I remember one in particular in regard to communities in Judea and Samaria back under I believe it was under the Obama administration, if I'm not mistaken. I remember seeing the whole room standing up there, clapping, essentially condemning all of the Jews who live in Judea and Samaria. But I think in this case, at least for now, you're right. I think the U.S. is going to go ahead and veto at this point.
And Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, she said that the text of the resolution could, quote, jeopardize sensitive negotiations. And she said, I quote, the United States does not support action on this draft resolution. Should it come up for a vote as drafted, it will not be adopted.
Gotcha. So it looks like that will happen. UN or not, Prime Minister Netanyahu, as he did last week, continues to say Israel will keep going until we achieve victory. Total victory is what he mentioned again this Saturday night in a press conference. At the same time, Minister Benny Gantz, who's also in the War Cabinet, said that Israel will launch a Rafah offensive if hostages are not returned by Ramadan, which is on March the 10th. So, again, we have a few weeks left until that. He said that Israel will broaden its offensive in southern Gaza, push into the city of Rafah on the Egyptian border. He made those comments this past Sunday. So it looks like Israel still remains, despite any pressure we have from the outside, despite any UN resolutions, Israel still remains determined in its mission, number one, eliminating Hamas. Number 2, having the hostages returned to us. And number 3, ensuring that Gaza does not remain a source of terror, a terror base after the war is over.
Well, last night, Netanyahu told American Jewish leaders that Israel had defeated over 3/4 of the organized Hamas battalions. He said that there's a whole command and control network inside Hamas, and that they have taken out 75% of that network. And he said it is delusional to leave the remaining 25% intact, especially if it is operating within a limited geographical area. He said that Israel must press forward. Now, there's been a lot of pressure diplomatically to not enter into Rafah, which is the southernmost city in the Gaza Strip. It is the last remaining stronghold where the IDF has not penetrated, and it's also the place where most of Gazan citizens are holed up. Now, there are estimates being put out there that there might be as many as 1.2 to 1.4 million Gazans in Rafah. I have a feeling, and I've heard from soldiers that are inside the Gaza Strip, that number is inflated. There are many, many, and maybe even hundreds of thousands of people in and around the greater Rafah area right now because they've been told to move from the north to the south, and this is as far south as they can go. And so the international community doesn't want Israel to go into this area, and they have pressed Israel to protect as many civilians as possible. So it looks as though Netanyahu, and he said it last night, they will do everything that they can to get civilians out of harm's way, which, by the way, makes it much harder to fight because along with civilians who exit the area will also likely be Hamas terrorists, will probably also likely be hostages that get smuggled out of that area. But it's clear that Israel will continue and will go into Rafah and will do what it needs to do and will continue fighting. Gantz said, he said, the world must know and Hamas leaders must know if by Ramadan our hostages are not home, the fighting will continue everywhere to include the Rafah area. And he went on to say, to those saying that the price of an offensive is too high, I say this very clearly. Hamas is a choice. They can surrender, release the hostages, and the citizens of Gaza will be able to celebrate the holiday of Ramadan. It's always been a time in Israel where when Ramadan occurs, there can be violence. It's not like celebrated as just a holy month. It's holy also means killing Jews, unfortunately, in Israel. So the pressure's on, and we'll see what happens.
At the same time, with the hostages, there were negotiations, I believe, in Cairo earlier this week, which Israel pulled out of as a result of what Prime Minister Netanyahu said are Hamas's delusional demands. He made these comments also in his press conference to the media on Saturday night. Netanyahu said, we will not agree to those demands. When Hamas drops these delusional demands, we can move forward. And he mentioned certain things. Hamas said something about no Jewish access to the Temple Mount, stopping the war entirely, pulling all idea of soldiers out of Gaza. All sorts of demands, which Netanyahu said would mean Israel would lose the war. They were basically saying, okay, Israel, you want to lose the war, then we'll start talking about the hostages. And we're not having it. We're not having it. Israel's gone too far to get to the point where we're at now, just to stop the war, to give in to the terror organization's demands as they hold our people for 130 plus days in cellars and dungeons underground. The Netanyahu government appears to be steadfast in their belief that the best way to free the hostages is to apply more pressure. We saw the heroic operation we talked about last week, more operations perhaps like that, or perhaps putting even more pressure on Hamas till they realize it's not worth it anymore to hold these hostages, as opposed to Hamas, which just wants a hall pass, basically, in order to keep on and stay afloat as they continue their murderous and terrorist regime.
Now, Netanyahu has tremendous domestic pressure to get the hostages back. And what I think Netanyahu has been able to do successfully over the last several weeks is change some of the dialogue inside the country, where on the one hand, beforehand, the families of the hostages are doing their job, which is to press the government to get their children home, to get the hostages back.
Absolutely.
I have nothing, but respect and sympathy and great empathy for what these families are going through. They should be pressing on the government every single day to get their loved ones home without question. But what Netanyahu has managed to do is to remind everybody that they did negotiate to get 110 hostages back. They also rescued 2 hostages just recently. So now up to 113 hostages, because one was found early in the war as well. That the best way to get the hostages back is to apply unceasing pressure on Hamas, and now you're starting to see public opinion in Israel shifting. And part of that is because of the soldiers who are saying, we see victory in our sights. We need to go all the way. And these demands by Hamas are basically to try to get Israel to stop in its tracks. When they talk about a different humanitarian ceasefire, remember when we got 110 soldiers back, 110 hostages back, there was about a 10-day cessation in the hostilities. Now Hamas is talking about a 6-week cessation of the hostilities, because what they want is that if Israel stops for a period of 6 weeks, that they won't be able to start again, that there'll be so much international pressure, especially if some hostages come back, that the international community won't let Israel continue on. So I do think that Netanyahu has done a good job of explaining this to the Israeli public. The Israeli public now supports going to the end of the war, even if it means that some of these hostages might not come back.
You mentioned public opinion, and, I kind of hate to talk about it in the midst of a war, but there are polls going out now and talks of elections, even though the next election isn't scheduled for, 3+ years. But former Prime Minister, I think you have the direct quote, Ehud Barak, took to Twitter Space, a forum for live conversation on what is now X, and he argued essentially that Israel must hold elections as soon as possible, despite the fact that the most recent electoral polls show that the right wing, that led by the Likud party, has a majority. Will they be able at this point to reach 61? I think it's about 59 seats in the Knesset if elections were held now, but they still have a majority over the left wing. And those numbers were different towards the beginning of the war, but now they are shifting more to the right, if you will. And again, Netanyahu, I think, made a comment during his latest cabinet meeting when somebody asked him, or a reporter maybe it was, or somebody else asked him about elections, and he said, well, those aren't happening for another 3 years. Those are scheduled down the road. And we know in Israel that the governments usually don't last the full term. That's just based on our history. But if you have that Ehud Barak quote, former prime minister, for whatever it's worth, let's hear what he had to say.
Barak said that Israel must hold elections by June if it is to have a chance to accept the Biden administration's plan for a post-war Gaza Strip. And what he said specifically is that Israel is urgently required to be prepared at a later stage in this process of bringing the revitalized Palestinian Authority to Gaza and entering into a political process whose goal is ultimately 2 states. He said there's only a small window of opportunity to accept the U.S. plan because he says that proposal will require the approval of a majority of Congress. Meaning at least 15 Republican senators would need to support it. And so he says, quote, there's no chance that after April or May, such a thing could be passed during the American election campaign when Trump or whoever will run for president. The Republicans will probably say we are not handing Biden any achievements.
Number one, I just want to ask you, number one, is former Prime Minister Ehud Barak still relevant, number one? And number two, by the way, this whole notion of we didn't mention it before, of a PA state. Minister Gideon Sa'ar said that if Israel would agree to something like this, which Ehud Barak looks like he envisions, of bringing Fatah back or rewarding terror by giving them a state, essentially makes Israel the allies in 1938 who turned over parts of Czechoslovakia to the Nazi Party, and we see how that ended. So if you can, both of those.
Well, Ehud Barak ran against Netanyahu in 1999. Bill Clinton is very public about the fact that he sent over all of his political consultants and put as much pressure as he could to try to get Netanyahu replaced. And Barak did beat Netanyahu in 1999 after Netanyahu was prime minister the first time for 3 years. he was one of the shortest lasting prime ministers in Israel's history. And even after his government was starting to fall apart, he offered up over 95% of Judea and Samaria and parts of Jerusalem to the Palestinian Authority for the creation of a Palestinian state, which the Palestinian Authority rejected. They rejected that all too gracious offer that he shouldn't have made and didn't have a mandate to make because he'd already lost his government. Now, you ask if Ehud Barak is still relevant. The reason why Ehud Barak is still relevant is because he has been one of the masterminds behind the anti-Netanyahu protest movement. And there's been 5 elections in less than 5 years here in Israel. And he's also one of the masterminds behind the anti-judicial reform movement here in Israel. It's the exact same people. So Barak has been really one of the stirrers of the political pot here. And fortunately, most Israeli voters would pick Netanyahu and his policies over Ehud Barak and his policies. Barak is a disgraced former prime minister, but still causing Netanyahu and the state of Israel tremendous damage in his role as an operator behind the scenes.
Just one last thing here, also related to the war. We've seen over the course of the last week, we've seen that the Hamas in Gaza still has the ability to fire rockets, obviously much less than at the beginning of the war. A few rockets raining down on the south. And at the same time, there was an Israeli soldier who was killed in a rocket attack from Lebanon. I believe she was in Tzfat when she was killed by a direct hit to the building she was in, with other people wounded. The north still has hundreds of thousands of Israelis not at home. The south, hundreds of thousands of Israelis still not living in their homes as a result of the situation. Just if you can, let's just summarize the situation in both of those locations, the north of the country and in the south.
Well, everybody understands in Gaza in the south, the Israeli operation inside the Gaza Strip goes full force. It does seem like it could be going on for several more months. What Israel's been trying to do is to postpone a full engagement inside Lebanon, but there's literally been thousands of rockets, missiles, drones, anti-tank guided missiles fired at Israeli positions from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And by all accounts, Hezbollah is a much stronger fighting force than Hamas. They have maybe 5 times as many soldiers, and they also have over 150,000 rockets, many of them provided directly from Iran via land bridge between Iraq, Syria, into southern Lebanon. And these aren't the Qassam rockets that Hamas possesses and fires from Gaza. Many of these missiles are precision guided. They can hit direct and strategic targets. They have much larger payrolls, and they could blanket the payloads, and they could blanket the entire nation of Israel, especially if they start firing in rapid fire. So what Israel's been trying to do is not fight 2 fronts at the same time. And what that would allow Israel to do is to complete the operation in Gaza, move its troops, move its tanks up to the north, and also give time to the IDF in order to make sure that the missile defense systems are strengthened. They're working on that, and also to try to make sure that they get rearmed. And that's why these discussions about rearmaments from the United States are so important. Meanwhile, the United States is trying to prevent all-out conflict with Lebanon. Jack Lew said last night to the American Jewish leaders that Lebanon doesn't want a war, that a war could be very dangerous for Israel, and it's their priority to try to prevent all-out war from breaking out. And they've sent their energy envoy, Amos Hochstein, who's believed to be a trusted advisor of Biden, who is the one who negotiated Israel's giving of a major national gas reserve to Lebanon when Yair Lapid was prime minister for a very brief period of time. And he's trying to negotiate between Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah, with whichever channels he has to discuss with Hezbollah, that Hezbollah should enforce the UN Council Resolution 1701, which was signed after the war between Israel and Lebanon in 2006, which says that Hezbollah should not be south of the Litani River, which is 15 miles away from the Israeli border. Of course, the UNIFIL peacekeepers never prevented Hezbollah from operating very close to the Israeli border in the south. And So while the United States talks about a diplomatic solution, Israel is paying lip service to this because what they want to do is buy themselves time to keep fighting in the south in Gaza before they go into this full-scale war in Hezbollah, and to tell the international community that we've given all the opportunities for a diplomatic solution before taking a military invasion of southern Lebanon. But I think that most Israelis do understand that Israel is just biding its time and does intend to go in and launch a major ground incursion, a major operation inside southern Lebanon. There's different estimates about when that might happen. Right now, it's also the wintertime, and they don't want to go while it's cold. They don't want to go while it's raining and muddy because tanks do better on the dry land than in the mud. And so the question is, are they going to wait until March? Are they going to wait until April? Some estimates say May, and we have to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, the reality is some people don't realize over 3,000 rockets have been fired by Hezbollah terrorists in the north, and the resolution passed by the UN at the end of the Second Lebanon War, which put UNIFIL up there. Obviously, they are not doing their jobs. The fact that they've been able to fire all these rockets, and they haven't really done anything to stop Hezbollah. We could talk for a lot longer, but that's all the time we have for today on Jerusalem Minute. Coming to you from the heart of Jerusalem at the beautiful JNS studios. My name is Josh Hasten, along with JNS CEO Alex Traiman. Check out all of our content on JNS TV on YouTube. Come to our website, jns.org. Stay informed about everything going on in Israel and the Middle East. Continue to send your prayers for our IDF soldiers who are on the front lines, remain in Gaza fighting for liberty, fighting for the Jewish people and the state of Israel. Have a great week, everybody.